Good morning. This is Tracy Hales Vass, right on Four Corners on KSJE 90.9 FM in Farmington, New Mexico. Today, I am excited to talk to Ann Hillerman about her latest book that will be coming out April 9th, The Tale Teller. Good morning, Ann.
Good morning.
How are you today in Santa Fe?
Lovely. This is a lovely day. I'm really looking forward to talking to you about my new baby. I'm so excited.
Oh, I am so excited to have read The Tale Teller. I was captivated revisiting Leaphorn, Chee, and Mauelito. And what I like about The Tale Teller is Leaphorn's playing a big part again.
Well, that was my intention. When after I finished my last book, Cave of Bones, I thought, well, now it's time for Lieutenant Leaphorn to get back in the act as a full-fledged crime solver. So I tried to think of what would be a worthy case for somebody with his experience and his background. And part of that was my motivation in writing The Tale Teller. As I'm sure you know, Joe Leaphorn was the very first character that my dad created.
Yes.
And I think because of that, and in some ways he's kind of similar to my dad. He's a lot grumpier than my dad was.
Oh, good.
But in terms of his bright mind, his ability to connect the dots, to kind of see through people who aren't telling the truth, all of that was sort of like my dad. Made it hard growing up with him, I'll tell you.
But yet lovable still.
Lovable, yes.
Yeah, I find Joe Leaphorn lovable, grumpy, and hard to live with, I'm sure.
Yeah, I think that's what his housemate thinks in this book, too.
I think so, but I don't want to give that away. Why don't you give the audience a quick synopsis?
Okay. Basically, The Tale Teller has two main stories, and one of them is the story that Joe Leaphorn is working on, and it has to do with a box that arrived at the Navajo Museum. And along with it was a box of donations, and the box came anonymously. And along with the box was basically an inventory of what was in the box. But the inventory and what's in the box don't match up. And so the museum director calls Joe. She wants to keep this very quiet because she doesn't want the museum to be embarrassed. She doesn't want to jump to assumptions in case the person who sent the box just left out the item. So she thinks this would be something good for Joe Leaphorn to work on. And I think I can say, without giving too much away, that the item that is missing is an item that may or may not be tied to the Navajo's Long Walk, to the time that the Diné spent down at Bosque Redondo being prisoners of the Army before they were able to make the Long Walk home. And basically that was the start of the Navajo Nation. So that's one story. And the other story is a story that Bernadette Mauelito and Jim Chee are working on. And that story opens at the Shiprock Flea Market, where Bernie is there with her mom, and her mom runs into an old friend. And the old friend has just found a bolo which he dearly loves and which had been stolen for sale at the Shiprock Flea Market. So, of course, Bernie, even though she's not on duty, is she doesn't like the whole idea that somebody would rip off this guy and then would be selling it at her hometown flea market. So Bernie jumps into action, and one thing leads to another, and in the end, the crimes are all solved.
Even when she's on her daily run or whatever, she's always has that police mind.
I have to say, I have a good friend who is also one of my fine editors, and she is like Bernie's advocate. And if ever I'm having Bernie, maybe think about something that isn't appropriate, she nails me, and she says, no, you have to remember Bernie is a policewoman. And I think, oh, yeah, right.
She is.
The more I work with her, the more I really am coming to like her and appreciate her.
I binge read all the 5 books, reread them, and Bernie's evolving, and she's really growing in confidence and in everything, and she's so very real.
Well, thank you. She reminds me of a police officer I know here in Santa Fe who has been one of my consultants. And I know she would be embarrassed to hear me say those things about her, but I feel the same way about her. And I asked her once, why did you go into police work? And she said, because I really want our community to be better. And I think that is basically the same thing that motivates Bernie Mauelito.
I do too. I can see that. I really am pleased living here in the Four Corners and reading about the travels. I mean, they're always in the car. They're always driving, all of them, because this area is not many people in a widespread area. So the police people have to drive around a lot. I can tell you've driven this area.
Many hours worth. It's such a beautiful, beautiful part of the world. I'm secretly happy to get in my car and not have any cell phone service and just have a chance to kind of absorb the silence and the colors and just the magnificence of where we live. We are so lucky.
We are. And you've described it so well. For anybody who is out of the area and reads this, they have to fall in love with it too.
I'm pleased to hear you say that. I have to tell you a story. When my dad was first getting started in his career, he had a review from a writer, a critic from the Boston Globe. And basically it was a positive review, but the critic said, just when you think Hillerman is going to move something forward in the story, he starts talking about the scenery.
It's well founded.
And the funny thing was, Dad kind of took that as a compliment, and he often said, the scenery is as much a part of my stories as the story itself.
I'm really pleased with the way you capture the Navajo people and the humor, poking fun at white people sometimes.
I think that is one. Speaking now as a total outsider, I think that is one secret of the Navajo Nation's success.
I do too.
That they kind of know not to take themselves too seriously.
Exactly.
And they a lot of Navajo people I know tend to have a little longer view of things than a lot of us white guys do. And I think it helps keep things in perspective and helps keeps you grounded when things are running amok.
So how do you know the Navajo culture so well?
Well, first of all, I don't. I mean, I thank you for that compliment, but I have so much to learn. When my nonfiction book came out, Tony Hillerman's Landscape, my husband and I did some tours of the Navajo Nation with this group called Road Scholar, and those tours were wonderful. I met so many Navajo people who were so open and friendly, and people who had known my dad and were just happy to share stories with me. So it sort of all comes into a package. But I have a lot to learn, and I'm just enormously grateful for the generosity and the tolerance of my Navajo friends.
This is your 5th book in as many years. So you keep busy, don't you? Wow. Every day I just feel so amazingly lucky that I can just retreat to my office and spend some time with my imaginary friends. It really is great fun. The book I'm working on now is going to break that book-a-year pattern, though. It's set on the Alamo Reservation, and it involves a scientist who's working at the very large array of radio telescopes out by Socorro. I'm having to learn about the Alamo Navajo people, who I know much about, and then I'm also having to learn a lot about radio telescopes and the world of planetary science. So it's going to take me a little bit longer to get that book done, but I'm hoping my fans will stick with it. I'm sure they will. Do you want to read a little bit from this new book?
Well, sure.
Great.
Thank you for asking me that.
Yes.
So usually when people read, they read from the beginning because they don't want to give any of the story away. And I don't want to give any of the story away either, but this section I'm going to read is, it kind of shows Joe Leaphorn in action. And so I thought it would be, I thought it would be appropriate. And Joe, as I mentioned, Joe is trying to track down this missing piece that was supposed to be donated to the museum. And one thing has led to another, and so now he's driven out to Oak Springs, Arizona, which is a little settlement on the way to Flagstaff if you drive down Indian Route 12. And he has set up an interview with this woman who he thinks may have some clues that'll help him solve this mystery. I'm going to kind of start here in the middle.
Okay.
A woman was sitting outside, evidently waiting for him. She looked older than she'd sounded on the phone, like a person who had squeezed more than her share of living into the allotted years. When she smiled, he saw a glint of mischief in her eyes. "Welcome. It's cooler out here than in the house." She motioned to a chair with a flowery print pad. "Can I offer you some water?" "Thank you." She returned to the porch with a tray of napkins, 2 big green plastic cups, and a platter of round cookies covered with powdered sugar. She set it on the table, then handed him the water. "Help yourself to a treat. I baked them last night. I was too excited about talking to you to sleep." He saw a spiral notebook on the bench beside her, and she noticed him noticing. "After the accident, I put my husband's carvings in that notebook away. I don't know how much help this will be, but I was glad it turned up. I marked the page he wrote while we were in Santa Fe." She picked up a cookie and set it gently on a napkin. "It's interesting to see his handwriting again. Sure stirs up memories." Leaphorn took a cookie out of politeness and discovered it was good. He took another cookie when she passed the tray to him. She reached for the notebook and removed a paper clip she had used to mark the place. She opened it to that spot and then extended it toward him. "This is what he wrote about our trip. You can see the date at the top. The writing in black is for his own work. Alvin Fatboy Begay had been an excellent record keeper, an exception to the dual stereotypes that artists can't manage money and that Indians are poor business people." So if you want to know what happens next, you just have to read it.
And it's coming out April 9th.
That's right.
I'm so excited because I think people are going to love it.
Well, thank you. Thank
Yes.
you. I love it. You know, I love each book. It's like if you have a family of kids and each one has his or her own special talents. And
yeah. Good comparison. Before you picked up the mantle of your dad's writing about the Navajo tribal force, you wrote nonfiction.
Right.
What kind of a transition was that?
Well, it was interesting. Well, first of all, I was a journalist, and I think all of the school board meetings and the city council meetings and the planning commission meetings and et cetera that I sat through, all of that kind of gave me a good ear for dialogue. I mean, at the time, I wasn't thinking I would be writing fiction, but looking back on it, there's no better preparation for writing dialogue than spending a long time listening to different people talk. So that helps me make the transition. Also, I worked, as I said, I worked for newspapers, and then I also had done some nonfiction books. And in both cases, I learned how to deal with editors, how to respect their advice, which was usually good and usually very appropriate, and if it wasn't, how to try to negotiate or how to kind of listen to what they were saying and find the underlying problem and maybe come up with a fix that was better than I would have thought of or than they would have thought of. So those two things really helped me make the transition. For me, the difficult part was coming up with the stories. You know, I felt good about doing the historical research and writing conversations between people, but coming up with a mystery plot and, you know, planting just enough clues to keep people interested and just enough phony clues so people don't figure it out before they get to the end. All of that was really a challenge for me. Luckily, I had been a mystery reader my whole life, and the last nonfiction book I did, the Tony Hillerman landscape book, in preparation for that, I reread all of Dad's mysteries. So his voice was in my head, and some of the tools that he had used as a mystery writer were kind of in my brain too. So all of that helped.
It is a very intricate weaving almost. In the Tale Teller, there's so many different that seem unassociated crimes going on. And some, like you said, lead to the big, and some others don't. So it's like weaving a rug, isn't it?
It's probably like weaving, like how you would weave a rug as a beginner.
Right.
Where you
right.
Or maybe it's a little off balance, but in the end you just get it finished and you're happy.
And
yeah.
the title, The Tale Teller, explain the title.
Well, I had a hard time coming up with the title for this book. There is a category of Navajo rugs called Tale Tellers, and they're in my dad's last book. He made reference to a rug that had been woven at Bosque Redondo, or shortly afterwards, that was called a Tale Teller rug.
Mm-hmm.
And in some ways, Tale Teller rugs are like pictorial rugs, where they lay out the whole scene. So that was part of the title, and the other, it's kind of like almost like a pun. Then you have people who tell tall tales, and then people who tell lies, who are also known as tale tellers.
Mm-hmm.
So part of the mystery of the book is to figure out exactly what does the title mean.
Right, I think so too. I did recognize the resonance back to your dad's story that involved the Tale Teller rug. So I thought that was very clever.
Oh, thanks.
Mm-hmm.
Thanks. I love making references to places that he was or characters that he used in my books. It's really fun to do that. And I think it is kind of an acknowledgement of those readers who loved my dad for 30 years.
About his voice, he had such a strong voice in his works. And you have picked that up, but you also have your own voice. And I just think that's very unique how that's happened. How you still have his voice, but yet your own.
Well, again, I have to credit that to Bernie Mauelito.
Mm-hmm.
When I first thought of continuing the series, one of my main motivations was the character of Bernie. And I thought I always really loved her, and I had wished that Dad would have done more with her. So when he died and it looked like the series would end, I thought, well, gee, it's just such a shame for Bernie now to be forever trapped as the girlfriend and the sweet young thing who brings the coffee, and never to actually have a chance to solve a crime.
Right.
So Bernie was part of what enabled me to give the series a little different voice than my dad had, but still to continue a lot of the main elements that he'd had in his books. Exactly.
I can see that. I mean, Bernie is a very strong woman, and you tend to make strong women in your books. I mean, the Year of the Woman, you've definitely honored that.
Well, I hadn't even thought of that. Well, thank you. That's I might have to pat myself on the back.
Yes.
Well, it's funny. My dad often said that he had a hard time writing about women. And I think probably the best writing he did about a woman was in his wonderful book, The Thief of Time. Mm-hmm. And that book, the story in that book, unfolds right after Joe Leaphorn's wife, Emma, has died. And I don't know if you remember, but Joe's remembrance of her and his deep sorrow and his tremendous love for her really, really come through in that book.
Yes.
And I just thought, I mean, it's beautiful writing, but I thought it was interesting that Dad really had to wait until she was dead to fully develop her character.
That's really true, isn't it? Leaphorn still carries Emma with him in his heart.
He does. I think that's true for people who've had exceptional relationships with exceptional people. They may not be with us on Earth anymore, but you don't ever forget them.
Right. And he's got a housemate now, Louisa, and she's an interesting character, as is their relationship.
Well, yes, and totally different.
Yes.
And I love being able to point out some of those contrasts. And I think it's I give Joe Leaphorn credit for kind of moving on and being, a lot of people as they age tend to get less flexible, and I think he that hasn't happened to him. So Yeah, I give him a big thumbs up. I think my dad initially created him as kind of a prickly guy, and I think I was able to use that characteristic of him in Taleteller and in his relationship with Louisa, and it was kind of fun to work on that subplot. I don't want to say too much more about it, but I think readers will like it.
I do too, and I like the way Leaphorn is recovering from his accident, and that he uses English sparingly but Navajo fluently. And I like the way you have artfully switched between the two languages. You don't use Navajo in there, but it's really clear to the reader when he's speaking Navajo.
Well, that was a challenge. I didn't want to make it seem like that I was making fun of Joe Leaphorn with his disability, or that I was ridiculing anyone for whom English is not their first language. My own grandmother grew up only speaking German, and she always had a little trouble pronouncing English. And, it was, for me, it was kind of endearing. So when I was writing about Joe Leaphorn and his difficulties with English, I wanted to do it with some compassion, because I certainly do have a lot of empathy and a lot of respect for people who struggle with a second language and do their best to move on despite taking the risk that people might not understand them.
Yes, and that shows your respect for his struggles.
Right. Well, I was working on the next one today, and I had a brainstorm. So maybe I will be able to get it out in a year. I'm feeling very encouraged this morning. I maybe getting ready for our interview kind of shook loose some brain cells or something.
Oh, right. So do you write every day?
That's my goal.
Mm-hmm.
Some days things, life just gets in the way.
Right.
But I notice it's as if you're training for a marathon or getting ready to sing a concert. The more you practice, the better you get.
Mm-hmm.
And I also find if I don't write every day, I sort of lose my place in the story, and then I have to backtrack. So, yeah, I really try to write every day. Some days I might only get an hour in,
mm-hmm.
but that's okay. At least when I have more time, then I know where I can pick up the place. Yeah, and when I first started, when I was working on Spider-Woman's Daughter,
mm-hmm.
I had this rule for myself that I had to write in the mornings, and I could not, check my email or do anything, and blah, blah, blah. And I've learned as I've gone on and my life has gotten busier that now if I have an hour, I can sit down and I just say to my brain, okay, you know what we're going to do here, and sometimes it listens.
That's great. Sometimes, huh?
And sometimes it doesn't. But that's sort of how life works anyway.
It is.
And I'm finding now I can do a little writing in airports. I can write in hotel rooms. I think it's just a matter of really looking at writing the book not only as pleasure but also as a job. I have contracts for these books and deadlines. And because of my background in journalism, I really respect deadlines. So that acts as sort of a stimulus to keep me moving forward.
Read an interview where you talked about your writing process, and you are both a pantser and a plodder, right?
Yeah. How can that be, huh? Right. A pantser, for your listeners who don't know, is a person who just sort of goes into free fall and lets the story develop at its own speed. Whereas a plotter is a person who spends quite a while doing a detailed outline and then writes the book based on that outline. So the book I'm working on now, I've been following my nose on it, but I'm also doing an outline after I've written it. So if a couple days go by and I don't have a chance to work on it, I can look at those notes and see what it was that I was wanting to have happen in this part of the book. And I'm finding that kind of dual approach really works well for me. I think every writer kind of finds his or her own way to proceed, and a lot of it is just by trial and error.
I agree. And in a mystery especially, you have to kind of go back and say, this has to happen if this is going to happen down here.
That's right. And you have to think, gee, if this guy is guilty, I should have planted more clues early on.
Right.
And then you think, who else could be a suspect, and how can I make them look more suspicious, even though they're not really the one who did it. So, yeah, and I guess people who write from outlines can hold all of that in their brains at the very beginning. But for me, as I'm working on the story, I get to know the characters better, and particularly the minor characters and the characters who are new to a book.
Mm-hmm.
And I think it just takes me a while to get to know them before I can understand how I can work with them best.
Do you always know who the guilty party is when you start?
Well, no. In the book I'm working on now, I thought it was one person, but now that I'm about halfway done, I realize, no, it's not that guy. Although he needs to continue looking suspicious, but it was really this guy over here. Or a woman. I don't want to give anything away there.
Right.
Right, or a character who you thought was just going to have a walk-on role turns out to be so interesting that you need to give that character just basically beats on you until you give her more to do, and the next thing you know, she's back in another book. Sort of what happened with Bernie's sister Darlene.
Oh, I like
Darlene.
Darlene.
I didn't have Darlene when I was first working on Spider-Woman's Daughter. It was just Bernie and her mom, and then I thought, well, golly, Bernie is working and her mom is elderly. There should be somebody here. I thought, oh yeah, I'll give Bernie a little sister. Whoa. Yeah, I have a lot of fun with her.
Yeah, she's very real with her own struggles.
I think any person who's lived with teenagers and then people in their 20s, you realize there are just so many decisions and so many opportunities and so many places you can go astray. I'm a grandmother now, but my granddaughter is 2. Charming,
congratulations.
Of course. Thank you. But I can remember when my son and his friends were all going through that. It's like you just kind of hold your breath and hope that they, have enough good sense to come up with the right decisions. And I sort of feel the same way about Darlene. Yeah, I think because part of her choice, it's beginning to look like is going to be setting up a life apart from her mom.
Right.
And even though she complains about her mother, I mean, her mother is her anchor. Mm-hmm. And I think in a lot of cultures, for girls to move away from their moms and set up their own lives, it's tough. It's really tough. I mean, it seems funny to me that since her mom herself is an artist, that she doesn't have more respect for Darlene, who is an artist. Mm-hmm. But I think it has to do with how you define art and how you kind of what your dream. I know as a writer myself, while I would encourage my children to be writers, I know it's really hard to make a living as a writer.
Right.
And I think the same thing is true in all of the arts. So while you say, go for it on one hand, on the other hand you say, but how will you get a job?
Exactly. Well, I really like all the characters, and you must have so much fun living with them.
I do. It was funny. When I was working on Spider-Woman's Daughter, I had a dream about Bernie, and I was in this big auditorium, and I was in charge of setting up some event, and it was one of those frustration dreams where there was some problem with the electricity and the chairs hadn't come up and people were coming and the registration person couldn't find anybody's name.
No.
And I was looking around and there was Bernie. She was standing over there and she walked over to me and she said, you don't have to worry so much about all of this.
Oh, I love that.
I thought, whoa, well, thank you. Yeah, I mean, I still remember that. I almost get tears in my eyes. Mm-hmm. It was like a little voice saying, this is going to work out all right. Just do your best. The Cortez Library is going to be hosting their first annual author festival. And they asked me to come and do the keynote talk and also to do a workshop. Look on the Cortez Public Library website. They'll find information as the date gets closer. And I love your Farmington Library, too.
Yes, you've been here, and it's great.
It's beautiful, yeah.
Yeah, it is. We're really lucky about that. We're lucky to live in this area.
Yes, indeed. I often think when my dad's journalism career was moving on, and he'd been working in Oklahoma, and he basically was promoted to be the bureau chief in Santa Fe. I mean, bureau chief, he was the bureau chief and the bureau. He was a one-man bureau. But I often think how lucky I was that he didn't get offered say, Omaha or Chicago or Detroit or Sacramento, you know, my life would have been so different. And I don't know if Jim Chee and Joe Leaphorn ever would have come into our world. So
Exactly.
serendipity is really wonderful.
It is. Well, thank you so much. And people can find your book on Amazon in a pre-release form, and it will be on the bookshelves April 9th.
Thank you so much for your time. I really appreciate it.
I thank you for yours and for writing. That was Ann Hillerman on Right on Four Corners, talking about her forthcoming novel to be released April 9th, The Tale Teller. This is Tracy Hales-Vass, Right on Four Corners on KSJE 90.9 FM in Farmington, New Mexico.